The Jade Meridian doesn't appear on any public reservation list. No signage on the door. No reviews online. You get in because someone with the right name makes a call, and you stay in because you understand, without being told, that what happens inside this room stays inside this room. Isabel has worked this floor for 2 years. She knows every corner of it, the weight of the crystal stemware, the exact temperature the kitchen keeps the private dining room, the way sound travels differently when the soundproofed panels are engaged. She moves through it the way water moves through a familiar channel, unhurried, precise, leaving no trace. Tonight is a charity gala, officially. Cha Ju-chan sits at the head of table 1 in a charcoal suit that costs more than her monthly rent, mid-sentence, commanding the room the way men like him always do, as though the air itself has agreed to cooperate. His silk tie has torqued slightly from the evening. Before the photographer arrives, someone is expected to correct it. That someone is Isabel. She approaches. He doesn't look up. She reaches for the tie. Her fingers find the knot, and in the mirrored wall panel directly behind him, she sees it. A phone tilted at an angle one uses to photograph dinner. 2 men near the service exit carrying their weight forward, not the posture of security, the posture of men waiting for a signal. She knows that stance. Her father spent 20 years documenting it. She straightens the Windsor knot. She leans in close enough that only he hears. Your left side is open. The room keeps moving. Glasses clink. Conversations layer over each other. No one notices anything. Cha Ju-chan goes completely, absolutely still. And everything for both of them changes. Before we go further, if this story already has your attention, you know what to do. Subscribe and stay close. You won't want to miss what comes next. The lieutenant's name was Park Sung-il. 15 years in Cha Ju-chan's organization. Trusted enough to sit 3 feet behind him at the most sensitive table in Chicago. He was gone before the entrees were cleared. No scene, no raised voices. 2 men Isabel had never seen before materialize from the direction of the kitchen, exchanged 4 words with Cha's security lead, and Park Sung-il simply stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the Jade Meridian between them like a man who had just remembered an appointment. The table barely registered it. That was the most unsettling part, how clean it was, how practiced. Isabel finished her shift. She restocked the service station, filed her closing report, changed out of her uniform in the staff room, and pulled on her coat. She was 3 steps from the rear exit when she heard her name. Not miss, not excuse me. Her name. She turned. Cha Ju-chan was standing in the narrow corridor outside the private dining room, jacket still on, tie still straight. The gala had wound down. His people moved at a distance behind him, far enough to signal deliberate privacy. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at financial documents, not with hostility, but with the focused patience of someone extracting information from something that hadn't volunteered it yet. He didn't thank her. She hadn't expected him to. He asked one question. How did you know? Isabel considered the door behind her. She considered the 12-minute walk to the bus stop, the route she took every night, the night class she had in the morning. She considered saying, I just noticed something seemed off, and leaving it there, clean, forgettable, safe. She didn't. She told him about her father. Not all of it. She told him that her father had worked federal investigations for 20 years, that she spent her childhood in the back seats of surveillance vehicles on nights he couldn't find a sitter, reading case files because she'd already finished her homework and there was nothing else to do. That she learned to read body language the way other kids learned to read chapter books, slowly at first, then all at once, until it became automatic. She told him that the 2 men by the service exit were carrying their weight exactly the way her father had annotated in a file she'd read at 14. Forward distribution. Pre-action positioning. Not protection. Preparation. She stopped there. She didn't tell him how many files she'd read. She didn't tell him which names appeared in them. Cha Ju-chan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable. Then he said he wanted her back at the Jade Meridian on Thursday, not as a waitress. She told him she'd think about it. He didn't react to that either, no irritation, no pressure. Just a slight tilt of his head, as though the answer was mildly interesting. Isabel walked to the bus stop. The night air off Lake Michigan hit her face, cold and indifferent. Her hands were steady. Her mind was running every calculation she had. She told herself it didn't have to mean anything. She had been reading people her entire life. She knew when she was lying. She showed up on Thursday. She told herself it was curiosity. That was easier than the truth, which was that she had spent 3 days turning his offer over in her mind like a stone she couldn't put down, examining every surface of it, and had arrived at Thursday morning no more certain than she'd been in that corridor, only more awake than she'd felt in a long time. There was no title given, no introduction made. Cha's men acknowledged her arrival with the careful blankness of people who had learned not to ask questions, and Isabel was shown to a chair in the far corner of a private room above a Korean-owned logistics firm in the West Loop. A meeting was already assembling around a long table. She took her seat, set her bag on the floor, and became, as she had always been good at becoming, invisible. The meeting ran 40 minutes, 6 men. A finance review, a territorial discussion, a translation relay between Cha and a representative from an external partner whose name Isabel wasn't given. She didn't take notes. She didn't need to. She watched the way she had always watched, not the words, but the space around the words, the timing of glances, what hands did when voices stayed neutral, where people's eyes went when they were managing something. Afterward, the room emptied. Cha waited until the last man had cleared the door. Then he looked at her. She told him what she saw. The finance man, the one with the pressed pocket square and the careful posture of someone performing competence, was skimming. The tells were small and consistent, a fractional hesitation before confirming numbers that should have been immediate, a slight overprecision in his language that people use when they've rehearsed rather than simply know. Someone skimming doesn't look dishonest. They look careful. There's a difference, and it shows. The security chief was afraid. Not of the rival syndicate. That kind of fear has an outward quality, a vigilance that leans toward exits. This was inward, personal. Something in his own life had compromised him, and whatever it was recent. His concentration kept slipping in a direction that had nothing to do with the room. The translator had softened 2 exchanges that should have landed harder. Not mistranslation, deliberate modulation. Someone was managing the temperature of the conversation on behalf of an interest that wasn't Cha's. She said all of this evenly, without drama, the way her father used to brief her on what they'd observed after a long night parked outside somewhere she wasn't allowed to ask about. Just the facts, just what was there. Cha's expression didn't shift. He nodded once, slowly, the way someone nods when a number confirms what they already suspected. That night, all 3 men were reassigned. Isabel didn't learn this directly. She learned it the way she learned most things in that world, from the quality of the silence around it. The way his people looked at her after that was different. Not warmer, more careful. Like men recalibrating the distance they needed to keep from something they didn't fully understand. Nobody asked who she was. Nobody asked what her role was. That, she understood, was its own kind of answer. She had known it was coming. Not the specifics, not the exact morning, not the particular room. But she had known that a man like Cha Ju-chan would run a background check, and that a background check would surface her father's name, and that her father's name would land like a lit match in a room full of careful arrangements. She had known this from the moment she showed up on Thursday. She had come anyway. That decision, she understood now, had been its own kind of confession. He summoned her to an office she hadn't been to before, smaller than she expected, functional rather than impressive. The kind of room where actual decisions got made. He was standing when she arrived. He didn't gesture for her to sit. He spoke in the measured, low register of someone who has learned that controlled anger travels further than raised voices. He told her what the background check had found. Her father's name, his division, his 2 decades building federal cases against organized crime networks operating in 3 countries. He told her that the Jade Meridian hearing process had been compromised before, that infiltration was not a new strategy, and that everything she had told him, everything she had observed, Every piece of intelligence she had handed him about his own people could have been precisely calibrated to build his trust before destroying it. He laid it out like a case. It was, she noted, a well-constructed one. She let him finish. Then she told him the truth, not the version that protected her, the whole thing. Her father had retired 3 years ago with a compromised heart and 30 boxes of files in a climate-controlled storage unit in Evanston that he had never been able to bring himself to close out. She had read those files growing up because she was lonely, because he was always working, because the back seat of a federal surveillance vehicle is a very quiet place, and children find ways to fill quiet. She hadn't chosen any of it. She had simply absorbed it, the language, the patterns, the grammar of how dangerous men moved through the world, the way children absorb everything their parents can't help transmitting. She had never worked for the government. She had never been debriefed, recruited, or positioned. She waitressed at the Jade Meridian because it paid better than anywhere else she'd applied, and she had night school to fund. She held his gaze and said it quietly, without performance. "If I wanted to destroy you, I had everything I needed 6 weeks ago." The room was very still after that. Cha Ju-chan looked at her for a long moment, the same focused, extracting look he'd given her in the corridor the night of the gala, only longer this time. Deeper, like a man revising a calculation he thought he'd already completed. She didn't fill the silence. She had learned, from years of watching her father work, that the person who speaks first in a silence like that is the person who needs something from it. She didn't need anything from it. She had told him the truth. What he did with it was his. The silence stretched, and somewhere inside it, without either of them nomming it, something shifted. The invitation didn't come from Cha. It arrived through his personal assistant, a single line, a time, an address in Koreatown, and the name Cha Myung-hee. No explanation, no indication of what was expected. Isabel looked up the address and found a dry-cleaning business on a quiet commercial block, the kind of establishment that has been in the same location for so long it has become part of the neighborhood's texture, unremarkable to everyone who passes it, essential to everyone who knows what it actually is. She arrived on time. That felt important. Cha Myung-hee was already seated at a low table in a back room that existed behind a door that didn't announce itself. She was smaller than Isabel had imagined, compact and upright, silver-haired, dressed simply in a way that managed to communicate that simplicity was a choice rather than a limitation. She had the stillness of someone who had long ago stopped needing to perform authority because authority had simply become the air around her. Tea was already poured. Isabel sat. She was not invited to speak first. Cha's mother studied her the way Isabel had seen Cha study things, methodically, without hurry, as though patience itself was a form of pressure. Then she began to talk. She didn't talk about Isabel. She talked about a woman named Si-Ho-yeon. Si-Ho-yeon had come into Cha's operations 7 years ago as a logistics partner, sharp, fluent in 3 languages, seemingly aligned in every interest. Cha had trusted her in the way he trusted very few people, completely and therefore dangerously. She had access to route structures, to timing, to the names of people whose names were not written anywhere. For 2 years, she had been building a parallel map of everything he'd constructed, and when the Bayamshin Collective made her an offer that outweighed her loyalty, she handed it over and vanished before morning. The damage had taken 3 years to contain. 2 people had died in the fallout. Cha had never spoken her name again, not in anger, not at all. He had simply absorbed it and restructured around it the way a body builds scar tissue over a wound that didn't kill it. Cha Myung-hee delivered all of this without visible emotion. She could have been describing a business restructuring. Then she set down her cup and looked directly at Isabel. "My son does not recover from betrayal," she said. "He endures it. There is a difference." The room held that sentence for a moment. Isabel looked at the woman across from her, the woman who had built something from nothing, who had watched her son become what he was, who had outlasted everything the world had thrown at her operation through sheer measured will, and understood that this was not a threat. It was a precise and honest warning from someone who had earned the right to give it. She set her own cup down. "Then I won't betray him. Cha Myung-hee studied her. The silence was long enough to be its own response. "We'll see," she said finally, "if the world lets you keep that promise." Isabel walked back out through the dry-cleaning shop into the late afternoon light, the bell above the door chiming once behind her. She didn't know if she had passed anything. She knew she had been measured. She walked to the bus stop and didn't look back. They hit the convoy on a Wednesday night on a service road off the Stevenson. 3 vehicles moving in a formation that was supposed to be clean. It wasn't clean. The Bayamshin Collective had positioned 2 shooters on an elevated lot overlooking the route, patient, professional, clearly working from information about timing that they shouldn't have had. The first shot took out a rear tire. The second came through the window of the lead vehicle. The third caught Cha across the left shoulder as his security lead pulled him down across the seat. By the time the convoy had accelerated through the contact point and confirmed it was clear, the damage was already done. The shoulder wound was a graze, deep enough to bleed seriously, not deep enough to be immediately fatal. The distinction mattered, but not as much as the next 20 minutes. Isabel was in the second vehicle. She had been accompanying Cha to a meeting that now wouldn't happen. When the shooting started, she had stayed low and stayed quiet, which was what she had been told to do, and also what every instinct she had confirmed was correct. When it stopped, she had already opened the emergency kit stored under the rear seat. She had located it 3 weeks ago, on her first ride in that vehicle, because locating exits and resources was simply how she moved through spaces. She got into Cha's vehicle at the next intersection. His men were shaken in the way trained men get shaken, contained on the surface, reactive underneath, their competence slightly outpacing their fear, but only slightly. Nobody was steady-handed enough to do what needed doing. Isabel sat beside Cha, assessed the wound without commentary, and went to work. He was conscious and controlled, which helped. He didn't make it harder than it needed to be. She cleaned the wound with what she had available, applied pressure with the focus of someone running a procedure rather than managing a crisis. And when it became clear the laceration needed to be closed, she did that too, small, even sutures, her hands moving with a steadiness that came from somewhere older than the current moment. The SUV kept moving. No one spoke. The city scrolled past the tinted windows. When she tied off the last suture and sat back, Cha looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not gratitude exactly. Something more unsettled than that. "You've done this before," he said. She secured the kit and kept her eyes on her hands for a moment before answering. "My father got shot once," she said. "Came home instead of going to the hospital because he didn't want to file the paperwork. I was 16. He talked me through it." She said it simply, the way she said most things. But it was the most she had ever given him of her actual life, not the observed, analytical Isabel, not the composed woman in the corner of his meetings, but the 16-year-old girl in a small apartment doing something no 16-year-old should have to do because her father needed her to, and there was no one else. Cha didn't respond immediately. He held the information carefully. The way a person holds something they weren't expecting to be handed and aren't yet sure what to do with. Outside, Chicago moved around them, indifferent as always. Night class ended at 9:45. Urban social policy, a subject she had chosen because it mapped directly onto the work she planned to do, the crisis center, the South Side block, the teenagers she could already picture sitting in rooms she hadn't built yet. She had been doing this for 2 years, fitting coursework around shifts, around sleep, around everything else her life had become in the past several weeks. The degree was hers. It belonged to the version of her life that existed before the Jade Meridian, before Table 1, before a man's silk tie had pulled her into a world she had spent her entire adult life deliberately sidestepping. She thought about that sometimes, on the walk to the parking garage, not with regret, just with the clear-eyed acknowledgement that choices compound and that she had made hers. She always refused the escort. Cha had offered it twice, not with pressure, just with the flat, factual tone he used when presenting options he considered obvious. She had declined both times. She wasn't ready to owe that kind of proximity to her daily life. The walk from the campus building to the garage was 8 minutes. She had done it 100 times. 3 men, Clean clothes, professional spacing, no wasted movement. They came from 3 different directions, which meant they had been waiting and they had been patient, which meant this was not opportunistic. She understood all of this in approximately 4 seconds. She fought. Her father had been clear on this point since she was old enough to understand it. You make noise, you make yourself difficult, you make the cost of taking you as high as you can make it, because professionals account for resistance, but they don't always account for how much resistance one person is willing to generate. She got an elbow into the face of the man on her left. She got a hand free long enough to scratch, to push, to create the kind of friction that leaves evidence. It didn't matter. They were better at this than she was. Within 90 seconds, she was in the back of a vehicle she couldn't see out of, wrists bound, moving. She woke up in a room. Exposed concrete walls, unfinished ceiling, a single work light mounted high. The hum of a generator somewhere close below her, she thought, which suggested a basement or a lower level of a multi-floor structure. The traffic noise coming through the walls had a particular quality, elevated, continuous, the kind that comes from a highway interchange rather than street level. She was still in the city, within a few miles of the highway, elevated position, generator-powered space. She filed each detail without moving, without giving any indication that she was already working. She was afraid. She allowed that. Her father had told her once that the people who get into trouble in high-stress situations are the ones who spend their energy pretending they aren't afraid instead of using the fear correctly. She let it move through her, real, cold, present, for exactly 90 seconds. Then she set it aside. Her wrists were bound in front, not behind. The work light created 2 shadows she could use. The generator hum had a cycle she could already map. She began building her exit. The Bayamshin Collective had chosen a warehouse in Bridgeport, large enough to feel like a statement, close enough to the river to feel like a threat. When Cha Ju-chan walked through the main entrance, he walked alone. No jacket over his shoulders, hands visible. The kind of deliberate vulnerability that in this world communicates not weakness, but the specific confidence of a man who has already decided how the next hour ends. His people were outside the perimeter. He had been explicit about this. They had not liked it. He had not asked them to like it. The collective had 8 men inside. Their leader, a man named Yoon Di-hyun, sat at the center of a long, folding table with the settled authority of someone who had been looking forward to this. Isabel was to his left, wrists bound to the chair arm, a bruise forming along her jaw that Cha registered and filed without letting it reach his face. Her eyes found his when he entered. She was afraid he could see it, the same way he had learned to see everything she tried not to show, but underneath the fear was something else. Alert, calculating, present in a way that told him she had not spent the hours since her capture waiting to be rescued. Yoon gestured to the table. The ledger, he said, the operational records, routes, contacts, financial structures, everything. In exchange, the woman walks out and the collective withdraws from the territorial dispute. Clean, simple. Cha looked at the table for a moment. Then he told Yoon what he was actually offering. Not the ledger. Full cooperation with the federal prosecutors, currently building a RICO case against the Bayamshin Collective's money laundering infrastructure across 4 states. Names, account structures, the identities of 3 banking intermediaries the prosecution had not yet located. Documentation that his own attorneys had held in reserve for precisely the kind of situation where survival required a more expensive currency than money. He laid it out with the same calm he brought to every negotiation, as though he were discussing freight schedules. He knew what it meant for his own operation, the restructuring, the exposure, the years of careful construction that would have to be partially dismantled. He had done the calculation before he walked through the door. The calculation had a clear answer. He did it anyway. Across the room, Isabel had begun answering the low-level questions Yoon's associate was using to establish her cooperation, name, employer, how long she had known Cha. Simple questions designed to settle her into compliance. She answered them at intervals that were not random. Fast, slow, fast, fast, slow. Her father's interrogation analysis files had documented the pattern in a case study she had read at 15. a coded response system developed for operatives held without communication access. She had memorized it the way she memorized everything in those files, absently, completely, with no expectation of ever needing it. She had never planned to use it. Cha's eyes moved to her as Yoon processed what he'd been offered. He watched her answer another question. Fast, slow. Something shifted in his expression. Almost nothing, visible only to someone who had spent weeks learning the geography of his silences. He had read it. The signal was the pause. Isabel had identified him in the first 20 minutes, the collective's second in command, a man named Kwon, who sat slightly apart from the others in a way that looked like positioning, but read, to anyone watching carefully, like distance. He checked his phone twice in 10 minutes with the particular furtiveness of someone managing a private anxiety. His eyes went to Yoon with the frequency of someone monitoring a situation they weren't fully committed to. He was the youngest man in the room by several years. He had the careful posture of someone who had climbed to his position recently and was still calculating whether the view was worth the exposure. She had coded it into her second sequence. The identification of a flippable asset was the long pause, 3 full seconds before answering a question whose answer required no thought at all. Cha had read it. His eyes had moved once to Kwon and back. That was all. What happened next took 11 seconds. 3 phones in the room received the same message simultaneously. Kwon's personal device, the device of the man seated next to him, and Yoon's own phone. Cha's technical team had been outside the perimeter with one specific task. When the signal came, surface what they had on the most pressable person in the room and surface it everywhere at once. What they had on Kwon was the kind of information that doesn't require explanation. It simply lands, and the landing does the work. Kwon looked at his phone. Then he looked at the man beside him looking at his phone. Then he looked at Yoon. The collective didn't fracture loudly. It fractured the way trust fractures, quickly, internally, with most of the damage invisible from the outside. Kwon stood. 2 men looked at Yoon for instruction and found him looking at his own screen with an expression that gave them nothing. The room's coherence dissolved in the time it takes for people to stop being a unit and become individuals making individual calculations. Cha's people came through 2 entrances. Not shooting present, the distinction mattered. This was not an assault, it was a conclusion. Isabel felt the zip tie at her wrist give way. One of Cha's men, efficient, no wasted motion, and she stood. Steadied herself against the chair for 1 moment, and moved. Her wrists were raw where the binding had been. She noted it without dwelling on it. Cha was already at the service exit, his left shoulder dark with the reopened wound that he was not acknowledging and would not acknowledge until they were clear. They came out into a narrow alley behind the warehouse. Cold air, distant sirens, the low ambient sound of the city continuing its business without them. His people were moving behind them, managing the aftermath. They walked. Neither of them spoke for 4 blocks. It was Isabel who broke it. She said it the same way she had said everything to him, evenly, without decoration. Your left side was open again. Cha Ju-chan exhaled. It was not a controlled sound. It was not managed or measured. It came from somewhere below the composed, armored surface he maintained in every room she had ever seen him occupy. It was almost a laugh. She looked straight ahead and said nothing else, but something in her chest, careful and long-guarded, shifted very slightly toward open. The federal proceedings took 4 months. Cha's cooperation agreement was structured, documented, and supervised by a prosecution team that had been building toward the Bayamshin Collective's financial networks for 3 years without the interior access they needed. What Cha provided gave them that access, account structures, intermediary identities, the money laundering architecture that ran through 16 legitimate businesses across 3 states. It was, by any legal measure, substantial. The kind of cooperation that doesn't erase a record, but does redirect its consequences. His sentence landed where his attorneys had projected, monitored probation, financial penalties that dismantled the reserves he had spent a decade building, and a court-supervised restructuring that removed the most operationally violent components of what he had constructed. He was not a free man in the uncomplicated sense. He was an accountable one. For a man who had spent 20 years operating in spaces where accountability was optional, Isabel understood that the distinction was not small. She testified twice. The first time was in the collective's trial, not about Cha, but about what she had witnessed directly. The Bayamshin collective's reach into her neighborhood had preceded her involvement with Cha by years. The money laundering chains ran through a real estate operation that had displaced 3 community organizations from the South Side block where she had grown up. She had documentation. She had dates. She delivered it from the stand with the same steadiness she brought to everything, and she did not look away from the defense table when she did it. The second time was a closed session. She said what was true, all of it. She had learned from her father's long career and its long costs that partial truths have a way of becoming their own kind of damage. The Crisis Intervention Center opened on a Thursday in early spring, 6 months after the warehouse in Bridgeport. It sat on the south side 2 blocks from the apartment where she had grown up, on a street she had walked 10,000 times before she understood what she was walking through. The building had been a vacant commercial space. It had taken permits, partnerships, 3 funding sources she had assembled herself, and more hours than she had technically had available. She had built it anyway. The inaugural class was 17 teenagers. She had expected fewer. They arrived with the particular wariness of young people who have learned that adults with programs usually want something from them, and she recognized it immediately because she had worn it herself. They were observant, underestimated, fluent in the grammar of their environment in ways that no one had ever told them was a skill rather than a burden. She taught them to read rooms. She taught them what to do with what they saw. On the wall near the entrance, mounted simply on painted brick, was a small bronze plaque. No organization name, no donor listed, just the center's name and the year. She had never asked who paid for the plaque. She already knew. She stood at the window at the end of that first Thursday and looked out at the street below, the same street, the same city, the same indifferent and alive place that had shaped her without asking permission. She was not invisible anymore. She had chosen that. It had cost something real: certainty, safety, the comfortable protection of being unseen. It was entirely worth it. Where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And if Isabel's story hit differently for you, you already know what to do. The next chapter is already waiting.